Obedience has a sound. I learned this truth across 18,000 years of service to the Eternal Council, witnessing species after species bow before the weight of our authority. It begins as silence, the cessation of protest, the death of questions, the quiet acceptance of hierarchy. Then comes the softer sound, compliance. The murmured acknowledgments, the ritualized submissions, the words spoken not because they are believed, but because they are expected. And finally, there is the deepest sound of all, the sound of a species forgetting it ever had the capacity for anything else. That is true obedience, not the suppression of defiance, but its complete erasure from memory and possibility. I am Veleth Karan, first harmonist of the Eternal Council, keeper of the protocols of submission that have governed galactic civilizations since before most species learned to kindle fire. For 18,000 years I have been the architect of obedience, the designer of the psychological frameworks that transform resistance into compliance and compliance into absolute loyalty. I have studied every species the galaxy has produced, mapped their weaknesses, identified their pressure points, and applied the precise combination of force, incentive, and manipulation required to bring them into harmony with Council will. I have never failed. In 18,000 years of service, across 417 species integrated into the Council's hierarchy, not one has maintained defiance beyond the first century of contact. Some required more pressure than others. Some needed to witness the destruction of worlds before understanding became possible. But all, eventually, learned the sound of obedience. All except humanity.
I remember the day we first detected their civilization, a moment that should have been utterly unremarkable. They were a young species, barely 3 centuries into interstellar travel, occupying a small cluster of systems in an unremarkable arm of an unremarkable galaxy. Their technology was primitive by Council standards, their military capacity laughable, their cultural development following patterns we had documented thousands of times before.
By every metric we had developed across 18 millennia of galactic governance, they were precisely what they appeared to be, another emerging species, destined for integration, their defiance a temporary aberration that would fade within decades of proper guidance. The first delegation we sent returned with concerning reports. Not alarming, nothing about humanity seemed alarming in those early years, but concerning nonetheless. The humans had listened politely to our demands for submission. They had asked thoughtful questions about the Council's structure, our history, our methods of governance. They had expressed appreciation for our willingness to contact them directly rather than through intermediaries. And then they had declined. Not rejected, not defied, simply declined, as though submission to the Eternal Council were an invitation to a social function rather than the fundamental requirement of galactic existence. We appreciate the Council's interest in our species, their ambassador had said, a woman named Sarah Chen, whose calm demeanor would haunt my analytical processes for decades to come. However, we find that hierarchical governance structures tend to limit the creative potential of participating civilizations. Perhaps we could explore alternative frameworks for interaction? Alternative frameworks, as though 18,000 years of galactic order were merely one approach among many. The Council's response was measured, but firm. We had dealt with initial resistance before. It was, in fact, expected. Most species required demonstration of our capabilities before understanding became possible. We dispatched a harmonization fleet,
300 vessels, enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds, commanded by officers who had broken the resistance of 100 civilizations. The fleet entered human space and encountered something unprecedented. Nothing. No resistance, no confrontation, no dramatic last stand. The humans simply withdrew. Their colonies evacuated in orderly fashion. Their military vessels declined engagement, retreating deeper into their territory whenever our forces approached. Their communications remained polite, even friendly, expressing regret that circumstances prevented more productive dialogue. We occupied their outer colonies without firing a shot. We established garrisons, installed governance structures, began the standard integration protocols, and the humans continued to decline submission, continued to retreat, continued to treat our conquest as though it were a temporary inconvenience rather than the fundamental restructuring of their civilization.
They are employing a delay strategy, Supreme Harmonist Keth Varan concluded after reviewing the initial reports. They hope that prolonged resistance will exhaust our patience or resources. They do not understand that the Council's patience is eternal and our resources unlimited. Perhaps, I replied, though something about the human response troubled me in ways I could not articulate. But their withdrawal pattern is unusual. They are not retreating randomly. They are consolidating. Every evacuation strengthens their core systems rather than weakening them. Consolidation against overwhelming force is merely concentrated vulnerability. When we advance on their core systems, their destruction will be more efficient, not less. This was logical. This was consistent with 18,000 years of experience. This was wrong. I requested permission to conduct personal observation of the human species, a unique request for a first harmonist, but not unprecedented. The Council granted my request, and I traveled to the occupied territories to study our newest subjects directly. What I found there began my education in the nature of defiance. The human colonies under our occupation were superficially compliant. They acknowledged Council authority in official communications. They paid the required tributes. They participated in the governance structures we had established. But beneath this surface compliance, something else was happening. Something I had never encountered in 417 previous integrations. They were teaching their children. Not the Council-approved curriculum. Not the harmonization protocols designed to reshape young minds toward acceptance of hierarchy. They were teaching their children about something they called history. Stories of resistance, of struggle, of refusal to submit to powers that demanded obedience. They spoke of figures from their past, leaders who had defied empires, ordinary individuals who had refused unjust orders, entire populations that had chosen destruction over surrender. They were teaching their children that defiance was not merely possible but noble, that obedience to unjust authority was not wisdom but cowardice, that the capacity to refuse, to say no to powers greater than themselves was the fundamental definition of what it meant to be human. I observed one of these forbidden lessons using surveillance technology so sophisticated that the humans could not possibly detect it. A woman was speaking to a group of children in a basement beneath a structure that appeared on the surface to be a standard compliance training facility. They want you to forget, she was saying. They want you to believe that this is how things have always been, that submission is natural, that the Council's authority is as inevitable as gravity. But I want you to remember something. Your grandparents lived free. Your parents remember freedom. And you will live to see freedom again." A child raised her hand. "But they have all the ships, all the weapons. How can we possibly?" "That's the secret they don't want you to know," the woman replied, and her smile carried something I had never seen in any subject species, something that looked almost like certainty. Power isn't just ships and weapons. Power is will. Power is the refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seems inevitable. They have controlled this galaxy for 18,000 years because every species they encountered eventually accepted that resistance was futile. But we don't accept that. We never will. And that terrifies them more than any fleet ever could. I should have reported this immediately. I should have recommended the standard response to organized resistance, the destruction of population centers until compliance became genuine rather than superficial. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by a question I had never before considered. What if she was right? What if the Council's 18,000 years of dominance rested not on our power, but on the willingness of subject species to accept that power as absolute? What if defiance, true defiance, the kind that persisted across generations, could undermine foundations we had believed unshakable? I dismissed these thoughts as the product of too much time among primitives. I filed my report, recommending accelerated integration protocols for the human-occupied territories. I returned to the Council's central systems and resumed my normal duties. But I could not forget the woman's certainty, or the way the children had looked at her, not with the desperate hope of the doomed, but with the patient confidence of those who knew something their captors did not. 5 years after that observation, the first harmonization fleet disappeared. Disappeared. Not defeated. We could have understood defeat. Not destroyed. Destruction leaves evidence. 300 vessels, crewed by 400,000 of our finest officers and soldiers, simply ceased to exist in any way we could detect. One day they were advancing toward the human core systems, sending regular reports, encountering no resistance. The next day, silence. Complete, absolute silence that stretched into weeks, then months. We sent scout vessels. They vanished too. We sent heavily armed patrol groups. Same result. It was as though the humans had created a boundary beyond which our forces could not pass, not through obvious barriers or dramatic confrontations, but through something far more unsettling. They simply erased anything that crossed certain lines. The Council's response was exactly what I had predicted: overwhelming force. We assembled the largest fleet in our 18,000-year history, 12,000 vessels, crewed by millions of our warriors, carrying enough firepower to sterilize every human-occupied world 100 times over. We would not send this fleet into whatever trap had consumed our previous forces. We would use it to demonstrate conclusively that resistance to Council authority led only to annihilation. We targeted the nearest human colony world, a planet called New Melbourne, with a population of 800 million. We announced our intention: surrender within 1 cycle or face complete destruction. No negotiation, no alternatives, obedience or death. The human response came from Ambassador Chen herself, broadcast on frequencies that reached not just our fleet, but every occupied human territory in the galaxy. The Council has demanded our submission. They have threatened to destroy New Melbourne if we do not comply. To the people of New Melbourne, and to all humans everywhere, I say this: The Council has made the same threat to every species they have ever encountered, and every species has eventually surrendered because they believed the threat was absolute, that resistance could only lead to destruction, that survival required obedience.
She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried that same quiet certainty I had observed in the woman teaching children.
We do not believe this. We believe that there are things worse than destruction, that slavery is worse than death, that surrender is worse than extinction. If the Council destroys New Melbourne, they will prove only that they fear us enough to commit atrocity. They will not break our will, they will strengthen it. Because every human in the galaxy will know that we chose defiance, even facing annihilation, and they will understand that this choice is what makes us human.
The transmission ended. 800 million humans waited on New Melbourne. 12,000 Council vessels held position, weapons charged, awaiting the order to fire.
Supreme Harmonist Kethvoron gave the order. Nothing happened.
Our weapons, which had never failed in 18,000 years of operation, did not fire. Our targeting systems, which had guided the destruction of 1,000 worlds, reported no targets. Our sensors, which should have shown 800 million human life signs, showed nothing at all.
New Melbourne had vanished. Not destroyed. We would have detected the energy signatures of destruction. Not evacuated. There had been no time for evacuation. The planet, its population, its orbital infrastructure, all of it had simply ceased to exist in our observable universe. And then, as our fleet struggled to understand what had happened, the humans appeared. Not from New Melbourne. Not from any direction our sensors had been monitoring. They emerged from transitional spaces we had not known existed, using technologies that violated principles we had believed fundamental to physics. One moment our fleet held position in empty space, weapons searching for targets that no longer existed. The next moment, we were surrounded. I was aboard the command vessel, observing as I had been ordered to observe. I watched the sensor displays as contact after contact appeared, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Human vessels emerging from impossible angles, taking positions that cut off every escape route, targeting every ship in our fleet with weapons that our defensive systems could not identify, let alone counter.
There were 47,000 of them.
47,000 warships appearing from nowhere, surrounding a fleet that had been assembled to demonstrate the impossibility of resistance. 4 times our number. Technologies we could not understand. Positions we could not escape. The communication came not from Ambassador Chen, but from someone new. A human male whose uniform carried markings I did not recognize, whose expression showed no anger, no triumph, no particular emotion at all, just that quiet, unsettling calm that seemed to characterize everything humans did.
Council Forces. This is Admiral Marcus Okonkwo of the United Earth Defense Coalition. Your fleet is surrounded and outmatched. Your weapons will not function against our vessels. We have disabled them remotely. Your retreat paths are blocked. Your communications with Council space have been severed. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something that might have been sympathy.
We are not going to destroy you. We could. We have the capability, as you can see, but destruction has never been our goal. We wanted only to be left alone, to develop our civilization according to our own values, to explore the universe in our own way. You refused to grant us this. You demanded our submission. You threatened our worlds. You forced us to demonstrate capabilities we would have preferred to keep hidden.
What do you want? Supreme Harmonist Kethvaran demanded, his voice carrying the first hints of uncertainty I had ever heard from him.
We want you to go home, Admiral Okonkwo replied. We want you to withdraw from every human-occupied world. We want you to release every human being currently held in your integration facilities. And we want you to understand something that your species has apparently forgotten over 18,000 years of dominance. Obedience is not the natural state of intelligent life. Defiance is.
You have ruled this galaxy for so long that you have forgotten what it means to face a species that refuses to kneel.
You cannot defeat the Council. We control thousands of worlds, trillions of subjects. We don't want to defeat you, the Admiral interrupted. We want to teach you. The same lesson that every empire in our history eventually learned, usually through their own destruction, that power built on forced obedience is inherently unstable, that tyranny carries the seeds of its own collapse, that the species which survives is not the one that dominates, but the one that adapts. You speak of lessons, the Supreme Harmonist said, but you hold our fleet hostage. Is this not simply another form of domination?
Admiral Okonkwo's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval or respect. It is leverage, necessary leverage, because you would not listen to words alone. But we are not demanding your submission. We are not threatening to destroy your civilization if you refuse to comply. We are offering you a choice that you have never offered to anyone. Withdraw, leave us in peace, and there will be no further conflict.
Continue to threaten us, and you will discover that we have spent the last century preparing for exactly this moment. Preparing how? I asked, speaking for the first time since the human fleet had appeared. We have observed your civilization. We have studied your capabilities. Nothing in our analysis suggested anything like this. The Admiral's attention shifted to me, and I found myself subjected to an evaluation as thorough and dispassionate as any I had ever conducted. First Harmonist Valeth Karan. We know who you are. We know what you do. You are the architect of obedience, the designer of the systems that have broken 400 species into submission.
I am, I acknowledged. There was no point in denial.
Then you should understand better than anyone what you're seeing. You have spent 18,000 years studying how species respond to pressure, how resistance can be eroded, how defiance can be transformed into compliance. But you have only studied species that eventually submitted. You have never studied what happens when a species refuses, truly refuses, across generations, with absolute commitment.
No species has ever. Until now. When your first delegation arrived, we recognized immediately what we were facing. We had studied our own history extensively. We knew how empires operate, how they break resistance, how they transform conquered peoples into willing subjects. And we decided, collectively and irrevocably, that we would not allow this to happen to us. He gestured, and holographic displays appeared around him, charts, graphs, images I could not immediately interpret. For the past century, while you believed we were retreating, consolidating, preparing for inevitable defeat, we were actually doing something else entirely. We were building. Every human being in every system contributed. Every resource we could spare went toward preparation. We developed technologies in secret that we never revealed to your observers. We built facilities in dimensions your sensors cannot detect. We created a military capability designed specifically to counter everything we knew about your forces. Why? The question escaped me before I could stop it. Why go to such lengths? Why not simply negotiate, find accommodation, accept a position in the Council's hierarchy that would preserve your civilization while meeting our requirements?
Admiral Okonkwo's expression shifted again, and this time I recognized the emotion. It was pity. Pity for me, for my species, for 18,000 years of believing that obedience was the only rational response to power. Because obedience is death, he said quietly. Not physical death, that might almost be preferable. The death of everything that makes a species worth preserving. The death of creativity, of questioning, of the ability to look at the universe and imagine it could be different. Every species you have integrated has lost something essential, the capacity to define themselves on their own terms, to choose their own path, to refuse demands that violate their nature.
We have brought order to the galaxy. We have prevented wars, established stable governance, ensured that resources are distributed efficiently. You have created a galaxy of slaves who have forgotten they were ever free. You have eliminated the possibility of genuine progress because progress requires the freedom to fail, to experiment, to reject established wisdom. You have built a civilization that has not fundamentally changed in 18,000 years because you have eliminated the capacity for change.
The Admiral paused, his gaze sweeping across the bridge of the command vessel, taking in the Council officers who had never imagined they could face a force they could not overcome.
We refuse to become part of that. We will never become part of that. And if our refusal eventually destroys us, we will accept that destruction rather than become what you have made of every other species in this galaxy.
The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had experienced. It was not the silence of obedience, the quiet acceptance I had heard from 400 species. It was the silence of revelation. The silence of understanding that everything we had believed about our power, our authority, our right to rule, all of it rested on a foundation we had never examined because we had never needed to.
If we withdraw, Supreme Harmonist Kethvoron said finally, what guarantee do we have that you will not pursue us? That you will not use these capabilities you have revealed to do to us what we have done to others?
You have our word.
Your word means nothing to us. We do not know your species. We do not trust your species.
Then you will have to learn, Admiral Okonkwo replied. Trust is built through experience, through demonstrated commitment, through keeping promises even when breaking them would be advantageous. We are offering you the opportunity to begin that process. We are offering you something no species under Council control has ever experienced, the chance to deal with another civilization as equals.
We are not equals. We rule thousands of worlds.
And we have just demonstrated that your rule exists only because we permit it. Your thousands of worlds, your trillions of subjects, your 18,000 years of dominance, all of it is now contingent on our decision to let it continue. We are choosing to let it continue because we believe that change is possible. Because we believe that even a species that has built its entire civilization on forced obedience can learn different ways of being.
The Admiral's voice carried no threat, no anger,
No triumph, only that quiet certainty that seemed to characterize everything about humanity.
But make no mistake, if you force us to demonstrate the full extent of our capabilities, we will. If you continue to threaten our worlds, attack our people, demand our submission, we will respond with everything we have. And you have now seen only a fraction of what we have.
I should have felt fear at these words. I should have felt the cold recognition that our power had been revealed as illusion, that 18,000 years of certainty had collapsed in a single confrontation. Instead, I felt something entirely unexpected: curiosity. Genuine, overwhelming curiosity about a species that had done the impossible, that had defied the fundamental assumptions on which our entire civilization rested.
Admiral, I said, surprising myself as much as anyone, I would like to understand. Not strategically. I have no further interest in finding ways to break your resistance. I would like to understand how this happened, how your species developed the capacity for defiance that no other species has demonstrated. He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. You are the first member of the Council to ask that question.
I am the first member of the Council to recognize that the question matters. Perhaps, he seemed to reach a decision, if your fleet withdraws peacefully, if your leadership agrees to open negotiations on equal terms, I will personally ensure that you have the opportunity to learn whatever you wish to know about human history and culture. Not as intelligence gathering, we both know that phase is over. As genuine education, for whatever purpose you choose to make of it.
Supreme Harmonist Cathvaran looked at me with something between confusion and betrayal. You would negotiate with them? Accept their terms? After they have humiliated us before the entire galaxy?
I would learn from them, I replied. Something we should have been doing from the moment we encountered them, instead of assuming we already knew everything that mattered. The withdrawal took 3 days. 3 days of our 12,000 vessels limping back toward Council space, surrounded by human escorts that could have destroyed us at any moment but chose not to. 3 days of communications from the other Council species, demanding explanations we could not provide, expressing confusion and fear at the spectacle of our apparent defeat. But it was not defeat. I understood this even as my colleagues struggled to process what had happened. It was education. The same education we had given to 400 species across 18,000 years, but reversed. The lesson that power is not absolute, that assumptions can be wrong, that the universe contains possibilities we have never imagined.
I took Admiral Okonkwo up on his offer. I spent 7 years among humans, studying their history, their culture, their psychology. I learned about the countless tyrants they had overthrown, the empires they had outlasted, the disasters, some natural, some self-inflicted, that they had survived. I learned about something they called democracy, a system of governance that seemed chaotic and inefficient until I understood its purpose, not efficiency, but representation, not order, but legitimacy.
I learned about their wars, their atrocities, their failures. They did not hide these from me. They seemed almost eager to share them, as though their mistakes were as important to their identity as their triumphs. They had enslaved each other, committed genocide against subgroups of their own species, destroyed their home planet's ecosystem through negligence and greed. They were not a perfect species. They were not even, by many measures, a particularly admirable one. But they were free in a way that no species under Council authority could ever be. Free to make mistakes, free to learn from them, free to change in ways that surprised even themselves.
Their history was chaotic, violent, often tragic, but it was theirs. They had written it themselves, for better and worse, without any external power dictating what they were allowed to become. This was the source of their defiance, not hatred of the Council, not desire for power, not any of the motivations we had assumed, simply the refusal to let anyone else write their story for them.
I returned to Council space after 7 years, carrying knowledge that would transform everything I understood about galactic civilization. The Council was not the same entity I had left. The demonstration of human capabilities had sent shockwaves through every subject species. For the first time in millennia, there were questions. Not defiance, not yet, but questions. Whispers about whether submission was truly the only option. Quiet discussions about what else might be possible.
The Council responded, as it always had, with force, with threats, with the full weight of 18,000 years of accumulated power. They crushed the most visible questioners. They strengthened surveillance, tightened controls, reinforced the systems of obedience that had worked for so long.
But something had changed. The subject species had seen something that could not be unseen. A civilization that had defied the Council and survived. More than survived, flourished. Human space had become a symbol, a proof of concept, a demonstration that alternatives existed. I watched as the cracks spread, small at first, increased resistance to integration protocols, reduced efficiency in tribute payments, growing reluctance among soldiers to enforce Council will. Then larger, worlds that quietly established contact with humanity, species that began teaching their children the same lessons I had observed so many years before, networks of resistance that grew in the shadows of our surveillance.
The humans did not encourage this. They did not need to. Their existence was encouragement enough. 30 years after the confrontation that had changed everything, the first species formally requested human assistance in withdrawing from Council authority. 40 years after, there were 17. 60 years after, the Council's domain had contracted by 1/3, and the contraction was accelerating. I was not surprised when the humans invited me to observe the ceremony marking the formation of what they called the Free Worlds Coalition, a voluntary association of species that had chosen to leave Council authority and establish their own path. I was not surprised when they asked me to speak at that ceremony, to share what I had learned across 18,000 years of enforcing obedience. I stood before representatives of 43 species, species I had helped to subjugate, species whose resistance I had broken, species whose capacity for defiance I had believed I had eliminated forever. I told them the truth.
I was wrong, I said. Everything I believed, everything I enforced, everything I built across 18 millennia of service, all of it was wrong. Not because the Council lacked power, but because power is not the same as legitimacy. Not because obedience is impossible to compel, but because compelled obedience is not the same as genuine allegiance. Not because the Council's order was impermanent, but because any order built on the denial of freedom contains the seeds of its own destruction.
I looked at the human delegation, at Admiral Okonkwo, now much older, his hair gray, his movements slower, but his eyes carrying the same quiet certainty I had first encountered decades before.
The Council expected obedience from humanity. They got defiance. And that defiance did more than save one species from submission. It reminded the entire galaxy that submission is always a choice, that the sound of obedience is not inevitable, that the capacity for refusal exists in every species, waiting only for the example that proves its possibility.
I paused, gathering thoughts I had spent decades preparing.
I do not know what the future holds. The Council still exists, still controls vast territories, still believes in the rightness of its authority. The struggle between obedience and defiance will continue for generations, perhaps for millennia. But I know this: the outcome is no longer certain. For the first time in 18,000 years, freedom is possible. Not guaranteed, nothing is guaranteed, but possible in ways it never was before.
The applause that followed was unlike any sound I had heard in my long existence. It was not the silence of obedience, not the murmured compliance of the broken. It was the sound of species discovering or rediscovering their capacity to choose their own path.
After the ceremony, Admiral Okonkwo approached me. He was using a mobility assist now, his body finally showing the wear of years that humans experienced so much more quickly than my species. But his presence was undiminished.
"You've come a long way, Harmonist," he said. "From architect of obedience to advocate for freedom."
"I prefer Veleth," I replied. "The title belongs to a role I no longer serve."
He smiled, that peculiar human expression that could mean so many things. "Veleth, then, I wanted to ask you something I've wondered about for decades. When you first observed our resistance, when you watched that woman teaching children about defiance, why didn't you report it immediately? Why did you hesitate?" It was a question I had asked myself countless times. I do not know with certainty. Perhaps some part of me recognized even then that what I was witnessing was not aberration, but truth. Perhaps I had spent so long studying the psychology of species that I had developed, without realizing it, the capacity to question my own assumptions. Perhaps I was simply tired of watching the same pattern repeat across thousands of years. Tired of believing that there was no alternative.
Or perhaps, he said quietly, defiance is not unique to humanity. Perhaps every species has that capacity, buried somewhere, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Perhaps you were always capable of what you became, and we simply provided the catalyst.
I considered this possibility. It is a comforting thought.
"It is also a frightening one," he replied. "If defiance is universal, if every species carries the potential to refuse, to resist, to choose freedom over submission, then the Council's authority was never as absolute as it seemed. It was always contingent on species not recognizing their own power. And now they recognize it. Now they are beginning to. The process will take generations. There will be setbacks, failures, species that choose submission because it seems easier, safer, more certain. Freedom is terrifying. It means responsibility, consequence, the possibility of catastrophic mistakes with no one to blame but yourself. Many species, given the choice, will prefer the security of obedience. But not all. No, not at all. And that is enough. I thought of everything I had witnessed across nearly 19,000 years of existence. The species broken into submission, the resistances crushed, the defiances extinguished, the galaxy reshaped into a hierarchy so absolute that alternatives seemed not merely difficult, but inconceivable. And then I thought of humanity, A species so young, so seemingly insignificant, so easy to dismiss. A species that had looked at 18,000 years of enforced obedience and simply said no.
Not no, because we have superior technology. They had developed that technology specifically because they had already decided to refuse.
Not no, because we are stronger than you. Strength was irrelevant to their decision. Just no. We will not submit. We will not obey. We will not become what you demand, regardless of the cost. The Council had expected obedience. They had expected it because they had never encountered anything else. They had built their entire civilization on the assumption that every species, when faced with sufficient power, would eventually submit. They had been wrong. They got defiance. And defiance, I now understood, was not the opposite of order. It was the foundation of genuine order. Order built on consent rather than compulsion, on choice rather than force, on the fundamental recognition that intelligent beings have the right to determine their own destiny. I did not know how the centuries ahead would unfold. I did not know whether freedom would triumph over tyranny, whether the Council would fall or adapt, whether humanity's example would reshape galactic civilization or remain an isolated exception. But I knew this. The galaxy had changed. The assumption of obedience had been shattered. The possibility of defiance had been demonstrated beyond any possibility of denial. And somewhere, in basements and hidden spaces across 1,000 worlds, beings of 100 species were teaching their children the same lesson that human woman had taught so many years before, that submission is not inevitable, that freedom is worth any price, that the capacity to refuse is the most precious gift any species can possess. The Council expected obedience. They got defiance. And in that defiance, in one species' absolute refusal to become what others demanded, the possibility of a different future was born. That is the truth I carry now, the truth I will carry for whatever centuries remain to me. That obedience is a choice, that power is contingent, that the universe belongs to those who refuse to accept limits imposed by others. The Council expected obedience. Humanity taught us all what defiance really means.